Welcome to Spotlight. Joining us is Linda Darling-Hammond from Stanford University, Ducommun Professor of Education. You've launched there the Stanford Educational Leadership Institute and the School Redesign Network. Dr. Hammond served as head of the Obama transition team for education. But you also began at the beginning. You were a teacher. Welcome.
Thank you.
You know, Linda, you've argued that education ought to be perceived as a civil right, and that what we have in our nation is an educational debt, decades, centuries really, you say, of a situation in which the disadvantaged have not had equitable access to a quality education. Could you sort of fill us in on how this idea
This concept of an educational debt was actually put forth by Gloria Ladson-Billings, who argued that while we talk about an achievement gap, what we really have to deal with is the educational debt that started for African American citizens with the deprivation of education. It was a crime in the southern states to teach a slave to read. And it was a crime to offer schooling for a long time. And then when emancipation finally came, schools were very differentially funded. There was a study actually in New York in the 1800s about how for every $16 spent on a white child, 1 cent was spent on black children. For their education. So huge differentials. Of course, that was litigated over the years through Brown versus Board of Education. But it was well after a decade after Brown that actual desegregation began. And we still have a very unequally funded school system. So while other high-achieving countries fund schools centrally and equally, the best funded schools in this country, public schools, spend 10 times more than the worst funded schools. In any given state, it's about a 3-to-1 ratio of funding between the affluent schools serving the wealthy and the schools serving the very poor. So we have a very big agenda to undertake to close the opportunity gap that underlies the achievement gap.
So is the solution school readiness?
Well, school readiness is definitely part of the problem, part of the solution. There has been a great deal of gain made through early childhood education programs because, in fact, we have an achievement gap at the beginning of school. That's also caused by some of the other inequities in our society. We have more children in poverty in this country than any other industrialized nation. About a quarter of our children are living in poverty. And we have a more tattered safety net than other industrialized nations, which routinely provide housing and health care and the fundamentals to make a life. Whereas in this country, of course, as you know, more and more children are homeless. More and more children lack health care. And so when we think about what it's going to take to close the achievement gap, the difference when kids enter school at 5 years old in the amount of vocabulary that they've mastered, in the learning opportunities they've had, in their access to books, to libraries, to being read to and engaging in a variety of educational activities is highly differential. Early childhood education helps. Preschool has a strong effect on reducing later school failure, special education, dropout, etc. Many states have made headway in that regard. But if we don't equalize what happens when kids get to school, the effects of preschool start to wash out.
Can you give us an illustration of what you mean by equalize opportunities at the school setting? What's going on now that really sort of concretizes for you that differential of the 3-to-1 in the dollar investment you were speaking of?
Yeah. Well, let me just talk about California, where I live now. And California, of course, has a big achievement gap and opportunity gap between it and the rest of the country because it's 48th in school expenditures. So whereas a child in New Jersey...
48th, highest, lowest?
Lowest.
In California?
In California with a very high cost of living. So we spend many, many thousands of dollars per pupil less than states on the East Coast that invest more. Then within California, The highest spending districts spend over $20,000 per pupil. The lowest spending spend about $6,000 per pupil. What does that mean for the kids? It means we have schools where the facilities are crumbling, where literally ceiling tiles are falling out, where there's little heat in the winter and kids have to wear gloves, and where there's no air conditioning in the summer when it's over 90 degrees. It means that there are many schools with no libraries in California that serve low-income students and students of color, no librarians, no art and music programs, no physical education facilities or sports activities, where most of the teachers are untrained and uncredentialed and inexperienced and come and go with great regularity, so it's a revolving door of teachers. It means they often don't have enough books for kids to take home, a book to study in the evening, so they can't do homework. It means there's not enough paper unless the teachers buy the paper themselves. Many of our schools, and this is not unique to California, really look like schools that you would think would be in third world countries.
Now, the layoffs that are about to happen or have happened in California of school teachers, do you anticipate that the impact will be worse in the poorer communities, or will everybody get their fair share of cuts, if that's a fair question?
No, the cuts, as always, will fall hardest on the poorest communities that are already struggling. There are some poor communities in California that right now are thinking they may not open school in September.
Could you say that again?
There are some poor schools and districts in California that may not open school in September.
In the United States?
In the United States. We have allowed it to get very, very bad.
Linda, I'd like to ask you to fill us in on some numbers. This story about possibly schools not opening in September takes my breath away. But also in thinking about this issue and preparing to visit with you, I got a chance to sort of delve into the numbers. And as much as I thought I knew, and I suspect as much as our audience thought they knew about the situation, about school dropout in the United States, we really don't internalize these numbers. I don't know why that is, but could you sort of give us a sense of where we are on the school dropout rates in the United States? Is it improving? Is it getting worse? How has it looked over time?
Yeah. It might be useful to think about where we are in international perspective. We are, achievement-wise, ranking 35th out of 40 nations in mathematics achievement among the top 40.
At the highest or the lowest?
The lowest.
35th out of 40.
Yeah. In science, 31st out of 40. Usually we do a little better in reading, relatively speaking, closer to the average, but we don't have reading scores from the last international assessment. But we dropped in all of these areas over recent years. We are also in the bottom tier of industrialized countries in graduation rates. We used to be among the highest graduation rates, but we're now graduating about 70% of our students within 4 years after ninth grade. And we're going down in graduation rates. In California, we've dropped to about 67% of kids graduating, but only 55% of African American students and Latino students. We are going down in our rankings in higher education access. We used to be number 1 in the world. We're now 17th and dropping about 2 rankings each year because we are treading water while other nations are making enormous investments. And our outcomes are among the most inequitable of any country.